Hello and thank you. Just by way of introducing myself, I'll just go right for it and come out as someone who really has no idea what the offsides rule is in football. But until I heard from my fellow panelists, I had no idea that was because I'm a woman. I thought it was because I'm a hockey player. Thank you. To start my talk, to state the obvious, the central organizing principle of sport is along a gender binary, or a sex binary, if I could be more precise. The default and most common way of organizing athletic activities is to have separate teams for men and women, separate fields of play, or even in sports activities where men and women compete together, to at least report their results separately. There are some valid reasons for this. There are generalized differences between men and women around athleticism, some of them perhaps influenced by biological factors, many of them influenced by sociological factors. That might make it difficult in some situations for men and women to play together. And certainly given the head start men had developing their athletic talent, the efforts that we've made in the last 50 years to try to improve opportunities for women would not have been successful if we had simply just flipped a switch when Title IX, for example, was passed and said, okay, whoever can make the team can play without regard to gender. So having separate women's teams is serving a purpose of improving women's participation. So I'm not here to criticize that model wholesale, but I am here to point out that there are a number of downsides to having a sex-segregated model of sport that perhaps get overlooked because it seems to be working well in general for most people, but there are people at the margins for whom the system doesn't work. Transgender athletes are the focus of my talk, and that's one of them. I do want to acknowledge at the outset, though, that transgender athletes are not the only athletes for whom inclusion is challenging because we use a binary model of sport. There are women who face exclusion because of gender verification practices. And there are women whose experiences in sport are compromised because they are held back by virtue of having to participate in women's sport. And some of the sort of inferiorizing of women's sports that goes along with that segregation practice. Those two things are both really interesting, and I love to talk about both of them, but I feel like it would be irresponsible of me to take on in a 20-minute talk all of those issues. Plus, holding a little something back is actually my strategy for getting invited back to this conference next year. So I want to talk about how sport organizations have been addressing the challenge of including transgender athletes. And the point that I'm going to make about that is just the descriptive point anyway, is that there are a variety of practices that are being considered by those organizations who are at least considering it. Many sport organizations have no such policy, haven't addressed it, and I think it's safe to assume that the default operation of that would be to exclude a transgender person from participating, at least according to their gender identity, in such places where no inclusive policy is set forth. So the first example of inclusion policy that I'll offer is from the International Olympic Committee. I'm guessing people have probably heard of this policy or perhaps its predecessor. The IOC has had a policy around transgender inclusion now on the books for many years. It recently, in 2015, it sought to modernize and its policy and make it more inclusive by rejecting some of its earlier requirements that a transgender athlete need some sort of sex reassignment surgery in order to participate in the category according to their gender identity. And I should say that just so that some of these words so that vocabulary is common to everyone, when I talk about transgender individuals who are affected by these policies, I'm talking about somebody whose gender identity doesn't correspond to their natal sex or the sex to which they were assigned at birth. And many transgender transgender individuals will present an outward appearance that matches their gender identity. Their gender expression, their gender identity might match. Some transgender individuals will also take steps, medical steps, to conform their body to match their gender identity. And there are surgical options that are out there that help transgender individuals, both those who identify as female and are trying to transition their body to a more feminine body, as well as those transitioning to male. There are surgical techniques that can be used. And up until recently, International Olympic Committee required that for anyone wishing to compete according to their gender identity. It recently, as I said, has modernized that policy and now replaced it with one that is focused on the athlete's hormone treatment. So this is another option that a transgender athlete would have. It's as effective as surgery for someone who's transitioning from male to female, in that you can surgically alter your hormone levels to the same extent that would be accomplished as if you had a gonadectomy. And so that was why the International Olympic Committee got rid of the surgery requirement and said that if you've been taking hormone treatment and your hormone levels are consistent with the sex that you're seeking to compete at, that will be sufficient. Importantly, the IOC clarified that someone who's seeking to compete in the category of male athletes, and despite a female sex at birth, a female natal sex, that there are no restrictions on that athlete. That athlete's synthetic testosterone will be recognized as an exception to anti-doping policies, a therapeutic use exception, but that you don't have to be taking masculinizing hormones in order to compete in men's sports. Of course, the reverse is not true for women's sports, that a transgender individual would have to be taking hormones that would suppress the natural production of testosterone to bring that testosterone down to a level that the International Olympic Committee has set at 10 nanomoles per liter of serum. So the International Olympic Committee's policy, obviously, this is just one of many policies that are out there. There are international and national governing bodies often set their own policies that apply to competitions that are within their jurisdiction. And so just as a point of comparison, USA Soccer on one side and Britain's Football Association on the other. In Britain, there's it's stated in the policy that there's no restriction on any transgender athlete wishing to participate according to their gender identity in youth sports, but that for adults, there is a hormone requirement, a requirement to conform your hormones to the standard level for women. And in USA Soccer, on the other hand, I would point this out as a more inclusive policy, requiring simply that the person's gender identity be sincerely held and part of their core identity, and that can be verified in any number of ways, not only medical ways, although you could use medical documentation to prove that, but other kinds of identification as well. Now, as we're in the United States, and as because the United States has a lot of examples of transgender inclusion policies, as I think in large part because of our unique relationship between sports and the education system, and the education system is being governed by civil rights laws, and so that translates into more motivation for scholastic and collegiate associations to develop these policies. I'll point out some of these examples as well. The NCAA uses a hormone-based rule that requires a transgender female who wants to participate in women's sports to have been taking testosterone treatment testosterone suppressing treatment, for 1 year. So rather than set a specific level of testosterone that you can have in your blood, as the IOC does, or rather than saying it has to be within the range of normal women, which is very vague, the NCAA says, in general, a transgender person who is taking testosterone suppressing hormones, the effects of that tend to level out after a year. So that person is who they're going to be at that time, as long as they remain on treatment consistently. That's fine for NCAA purposes. And someone who's competing, someone who is transitioning from female to male, may continue to play women's sports up to and until they start a hormone treatment with exogenous testosterone. And at that point, they would become ineligible for women's sports. But like the Olympic policy, you don't have to be taking testosterone in order to be eligible for men's sports. So you can see, of course, that it's the category of women's sports and the idea that we don't want too much, however we measure too much, testosterone in women's sports. Now, I promised somebody that I too had a map, but it's not as good as yours. But it is a map of the various and diverse policies that govern transgender participation at the high school level, and these are by virtue of private associations that are athletic associations. So I've color-coded them just so that I can kind of talk about them categorically a little more easily. There are the states that I've coded in blue, which have policies that are similar to the one I described from USA Soccer, where there's no restriction, no requirement that a transgender athlete engage in any kind of medical treatment in order to be eligible, as long as there's some evidence, broadly defined, that they are who they say they are, that they're asserting their gender for a sincere purpose, and that they're not simply, lots of people fear this, masquerading as girls in order to, I don't know, gain all the glory that is girls' sports. That seems to be a real fear that people have. But so these blue states have said, we're not so worried about that. You are who you say you are. We're gonna let you play. There are the states that I've coded in sort of maybe that's looking gray to you. Yes, looks purple on my screen. But those light gray states, like Maine is an example, that have a gender identity-based policy at its core, but seem to offer some exceptions and exclusions to it. Like Maine's policy, for example, says you can participate according to your gender identity unless it looks to us like that might be unsafe for some people, or unless it looks to us like that might cause a competitive disadvantage. So by kind of leaving the door open to the possibility that somebody might not get to play, I didn't in good conscience want to give these states the same blue color as the other ones. Then I have the states that are in true purple, and these are states that look like the NCAA's policy, so requiring a hormone treatment in order for somebody who's transitioning from male to female to play girls' sports for a year's period of time. And then lastly, last but least, we have the states that I've coded in red, and these are states that have a birth certificate-based policy, which is effectively saying that transgender athletes cannot participate according to their gender identity at all. Reason being that some of these states actually don't allow any kind of modification of your birth certificate, regardless of what kinds of surgical procedures or other kinds of steps in a transition that you might take later on. But even in the states that do allow that, those are not mechanisms that are accessible to somebody who is playing in interscholastic sports, because they're not medically prescribed for transgender youth or those individuals below the age of 18. So there'd be no way to change your birth certificate in these states, and so these athletes are limited to participating according to their birth sex, which is in effect exclusion. I mean, you can imagine it happening, but the discord that somebody would have to endure and have to be able to navigate in order to present and identify as one thing for purposes of play sports, it's going to work for some athletes, but it's not going to work for many, and so it's tantamount to exclusion. So I want to say just some words of critique of these policies that both exclude and limit transgender athletes' participation. First of all, it may be tempting to zero in on these policies that require hormone-based transition as a sort of compromise or happy medium that, hey, we're still letting you play, but we're also taking into account concerns about competitive equity. And I need to point out that these kinds of policies are not without cost to the transgender athletes themselves. It's not every transgender person who chooses to modify their body for reasons that would be highly personal and have nothing to do with sport. It's also not it's also not necessarily universally accessible, the medical treatment that you would need in order to get that done. There are, especially when you're talking about youth, you would have to first go through your parent as a gatekeeper. You would then have to make sure that you have access to healthcare, which is a challenge for many people. And even when you have that access, the cost of doing that, financial cost, is going to be high. Not to mention the health costs and risks of doing that. And the decision to start with cross-sex hormones, or even to start with treatment that would suppress the onset of puberty, is a very challenging decision that individuals make as they embark on their transgender journey, if you will. The timing of that decision is going to be so complicated and personal to an individual that to have it be tainted by the influence of, well, this is what you need to do if you want to continue to play sports, seems like unnecessary pressure on individuals in those circumstances. The next criticism I'll offer is that these policies that limit or exclude transgender athletes are not really securing some sort of pure, equitable playing field for women. There's so much I could say. But the idea that men and women are categorically different levels of athletes is obviously false if you can think of, I'll borrow the example of the Istanbul Marathon, or any marathon that you've watched, or the Boston Marathon, 30,000 entrants. The first 30 finishers were men. But that means all the other thousands and thousands of men in that marathon were beat by at least one, probably many women. So it's not as if men are good athletes and women are bad athletes. There's so much overlap in terms of athletic ability between men and women that using testosterone as this proxy for who's good at sports and who's bad at sports is imperfect at best. It may be a rough proxy, but if that's all it is, we have to recognize that the categories should also be rough. I mean flexible, right? And allow for as inclusive as possible definition of who qualifies as a woman in order to participate. Finally, it singles out trans athletes as the only sources of this competitive advantage that we're worried about. Why would we think about who might be excluded in the state of Maine? Some transgender girl who is deemed too unsafe or too much of a competitive advantage in order to play with girls. Well, why might that be the case? I'm imagining, say, a basketball player, and someone says, well, he's so tall, she's so tall, we don't know, we can't handle somebody who's taller than the average girl, which would be, I don't know, at least a consistent argument if the state of Maine was also policing cisgender girls who were taller than average or who were as tall as boys from being able to play. But it's only when these competitive advantages are embodied by transgender athletes that they become the source of scrutiny and exclusion. And then finally, I'll point out that the rigid policing of eligibility for women's sports is degrading to female athletes. It promotes the stereotype of female athletic inferiority, that women's sports need this level of really rigid, strict policing that we couldn't possibly accommodate truly handful in the grand scheme of things, athletes who might have bodies who are different than ours. And then finally, it, of course, devalidates the transgender athlete's identity themselves, and to say that in order to be a woman, it's not your gender identity that matters, it's something about your body. Now finally, if you were moved by the image of a youth sports program saving an underprivileged youth from being sucked into the pipeline to prostitution, or if you were compelled by the idea of sport as the salvation against bullying, think about, and you can see the social value of sports, particularly for people who are vulnerable. You've got to accept that transgender athletes belong is in the category of athletes who should be targeted for those kinds of interventions as opposed to excluded. I think I will, well, I guess, no, I should not leave it there. I should say that my proposed policy solutions, in the spirit of Tamar's presentation, would be to examine and scrutinize participation policies at all levels of sport and not assume that hormone-based policies are appropriate everywhere. And to that end, there should be a presumption of invalidity of any kinds of exclusionary policy, any kind of limitation on transgender athletes' ability to play when we're talking about youth sports or when we're talking about recreation sports. And then finally, I think, because I've neglected in my 20 minutes to even address transgender athletes who don't identify as either male or female, but as non-binary altogether, we also need to make sure that we are adding more opportunities to play sports in a gender-free environment. Not necessarily to replace the sex-segregated sports, but to add those opportunities to the menu so that those athletes, as well as all kinds of athletes who might benefit from those opportunities, could participate. Okay, so with that, I'll leave. Thank you.